After the coffee break, we'll have I'll just give you a brief intro in what we actually want to do in the workshop. And I figure now actually that we can discuss at that point whether we're going to split into two teams or just keep ourselves as one. And after that, after the workshopping and the brainstorming, getting everything down on a big piece of paper, we'll come back and go over that, do a little presentation, and then wrap up at about 2, at which point we should have got food, and that'll be it. So, Sam Baker is going to give a talk now, and he has come up from Croydon today, where he's...
All the way from Croydon. Anybody else been there? Tourist destination?
Thank you.
Oh, your passport, that was it? Well, it's normally at the Home Office, passports are IKEA,
Let me
that's
just
about the only...
quickly mic you up.
Fine, that's really why. Anyway, if you haven't been, it's got 126 green spaces and parks in it. People probably don't know that. So it's actually quite blessed in terms of space. So everybody, so thank you obviously for coming. Adam has asked me to talk about personal action and why that's important, particularly when it comes to the climate crisis. So I wanted to talk a little bit about my background, what I do, why I think it's important. If people want to share their own views and their own thoughts as we go, then by all means do. It's not exactly a massive group, so we can accommodate that. And I won't talk for too long. Okay? So just in terms of me, you can see my name. I spent most of my time in business. So I worked for a big company called Deloitte that some of you may have heard of. And most of that time I was working as a strategy consultant, which basically means helping big companies get bigger and more profitable. That hasn't really or only part of that time has really defined what I'm now doing or sort of helped me on that journey. So the key things, I guess, in my career which have done that, I worked in Tanzania for 6 years. So 3 years of that I did voluntary service on the side of Kilimanjaro. It's particularly, it's a strong analogue or metaphor for the climate crisis because it's snow-capped, and you could see that from where I lived. And over the years, that snow cap has become much, much, much smaller. Still there, but it's much smaller. So working in Tanzania was a sort of strong driver of what I do at the moment. Of the 20 plus years I worked at Deloitte, the last 6 years, and I no longer work there, the last 6 years, I focused on the impact that big organizations have. So through the Sustainable Development Goals, which were published in 2015, and then the Paris Agreement, agreed in 2015 and signed in 2016, that's when I really started getting into a better understanding of not just a company in its market, but actually the market in the broader system of the world. And it was obvious to me then is that there was so much work to do to help companies understand not only what impact they have on the world, but also why that's important. And it's not just important to the world, but it's actually important for the resilience and the profitability and the success of the company itself. So the last 6 years at Deloitte I spent trying to do that. And it was hard work. It's a hard story to tell. We work in a system here, a capitalist system, where big companies either explicitly or implicitly are focused on short-term financial returns, and to try and broaden that horizon and say there's actually this much, much more important thing, it is asking them to fundamentally change their perspective, even if they say it isn't. But that was important for me. And then the last 3 years, so I left Deloitte, and I really left it because Deloitte itself, so I worked with Deloitte itself, trying to think about what the purpose of an organization like Deloitte is, a professional services business. It's like working for a law firm. All those professional services businesses, the big ones, they don't really choose, or they're not particularly selective about which big companies they serve. I mean, they won't serve a company which has got too much risk in it, or maybe in a sanctioned country, but outside of that, they'll serve every sector, including the oil and gas sector. And if they're not going to do that, those big companies have to accept that that'll take a hit on their earnings and their growth, and they're not prepared to do that. None of them, so not the lawyers, not the professional services firms, etc. And so I felt I was working with an organisation which was part of the challenge rather than necessarily part of the solution, although there's good stuff done within it. And in addition to that, I suppose hit a bit of despair, I suppose, really, thinking about the extent to which companies and corporates were actually doing anything about the climate challenge. And so one of the last things I did at Deloitte, I interviewed 450 companies, not all on my own. And we interviewed them. We had a simple structure of questions. So, what are you targeting? So you might have a net zero target, or you might have an absolute reduction in emissions, or whatever else it might be. The second question is, why are you doing that? So which stakeholders or what pressure or what is motivating you to do that? We then got into, what are you actually doing? So what does that all mean at the moment? What are the activities? Then we got into the challenges, and we got lessons learned. So simple structure. We put it up on a database. We published it on the web. We made it available to everybody. We ran conferences or whatever. But the challenge was, these were people who chose to speak to us. And there's some big companies like Nestle or whatever. They chose to speak to us because they were proud of what they were doing. And of the 450, probably the biggest group of actions that were being taken were to prepare to do something. So, we're planning to do our targets. We are hiring a sustainability consultant. We're, whatever it might be. We're changing our strategy. All of those are good things. But when you stood back from it and you looked at the magnitude of the issue and the currency of the issue, and then you looked at everybody sort of gearing up for something in the future, it was like, well, this just isn't working. And not only that, I was typically talking to sometimes a strategy person, but very often a sustainability person, and that's sitting in a very small team in an enormous organization very often. Or in a smaller organization, it's not a dedicated role. So I guess I looked at that and thought, well, this isn't really working. So came out of Deloitte, not purely at my own choice, and now in the last 3 years, I've been working as a climate, or trying to work as a climate communicator, and an educator, and in a very small way, an activist. I'm not saying, I'm not as brave as Just Stop Oil, but somebody who is trying to sort of promulgate change in some shape or form. And the things I've been doing, for COP26, I organised a walk from London to Glasgow, and it was tremendous fun, but the point of it was to try and bring together lots of different types of people on the way up. So we had 8 meetings. We got school children, we got elected councillors, we got business people. We tried to put them all in a big room somewhere and then get them to talk about COP, talk about climate, talk about local issues and challenges. So it was hugely educational for me, and I hope it was of some benefit to those people as well. And it was just all part of trying to get the conversation normalised. So I did that. Last year I did a Glasgow to Sharm el Sheikh, where COP27 was. Didn't walk all the way, but what I did this time was I'd love to, but that would have been 5.5 months, so it would have been self-indulgent, I think. But so what I did is organise groups in 12 countries, so from north to south, including Lebanon and Turkey and Jordan, so a place I'd never been before. But you're so I think that the concerned people are so receptive, and so it was quite easy to form working groups in those countries. And those working groups got to work, and they did 2 things for me. One was to create a meeting. So we had a calendar, so it looked like we're sort of walking, but we weren't. It was just a sort of calendar. So they organised a meeting. Very often that was, it had to be virtual or hybrid. Some of them were enormous. So in Turkey, they got about 500 people. It was incredible. In France, I think we had 7, but they were big and small ones. But that was sort of super exciting to get to know them. And then the second thing they did is that we had an app, so they got as many people as they could across these different types of organisation to get on this app. And from the beginning of the journey to the end of the journey, people in school teams or friends and family or companies or whatever else would enter their details. And so we could feel like we were sort of walking together. So, some of it worked, some of it didn't. We ended up planting 200,000 trees on the back of that with the Jane Goodall Institute. We got 1,600 people walking. We had these 12 meetings, some big, some small. So it's very difficult to understand if it had an impact. But for me, I felt I was sort of trying to push forward or explore really to try and find where that impact might be. Doing something similar at the moment in Croydon, so from the ridiculous to the sublime, or the other way around. So now working in Croydon and doing Trees for Croydon. So we're doing something vaguely similar, but trying to mobilise the local community, which I know nothing of, or I didn't know anything of, to think about trees in some of the more disadvantaged parts of the borough. I'm casting around, and I do a number of other things. I do and Climate Fresk, which is an education thing, which Adam also does, which if you're nodding, okay, great. So really interesting 3-hour workshop. If people haven't heard of it, do look it up, Fresk, so Climate Fresk. And that's yesterday we were doing that for something called the Future Leaders Network, and this was about 50 young people, all with sort of aspirations to be politicians or whatever else, and we did this workshop. It's fantastic, and fantastic for us, to hear what them and to engage with them. So I do that, and I do a couple of other things with business. And the business thing is working with something called Business Declares. So it's a group of 130 businesses, and we try and bring a sort of slightly more activist agenda to those businesses who sign up. Not particularly successfully, but that's the ambition. So I guess the reason I'm telling you all of that, other than just to introduce myself, is to say I am casting around for what personal action means to me. Yeah? Trying to think where I might have an impact. And when we get down to sort of almost very personal, very micro actions, so in my home and house and what I do, I'm vegan, I've massively reduced my travel, obviously, because I don't work for a big corporate anymore, so that was easy. But also choosing not to fly sometime, choosing not to fly. What else? So that's transport, food, housing. I'm trying to get solar on the roof, and I have been for 6 months, and I will succeed, but I'm not there yet. So I'm trying to do little bits and pieces, but I don't have solar on the roof yet. I do fly if I go to Tanzania, because there's no other way, bless you. I shop at Tesco typically because it's next door. So, there's just so much in my sort of, I guess, the bits that I could do as opposed to the bits I am doing. So anyway, pushing forward on that. So the challenge, I suppose, is that we face this just incredible, enormous existential challenge. That issue is accelerating at the moment. We are emitting more. We've probably all seen that than we have before in terms of greenhouse gases. It's getting worse, not better. And so, without a doubt, if we're going to tackle the challenge globally, we need whole-scale policy change and system change probably as well. And even the FT was talking about the fact that the way the capitalist system is currently constructed, it's incredibly difficult, or it's obstructing the progress that we need. So we need that, and that doesn't feel like personal action. That feels like great big things that somebody else does or whatever. But obviously it's got a very strong connection to personal action. We'll come to that in 2 seconds. Before that, I just wanted to say sort of, I guess my motivation for doing stuff, and everyone will have their own motivations, for me, it's in part, and these aren't supposed to be particularly motivating feelings, but I actually do find them quite motivating. So one is shame. And so shame, having worked in a system which is just promoting this growth and profitability at all costs. So, consultants do that. They're honing the system. They are, adding oxygen, if you like, to the fire. So that's one thing. I do it because it's exceedingly interesting. Yeah, it is super complicated, very interesting. So many challenges, to get people to change, but to understand what it is that we should do and who do you engage with. So it's a sort of fascinating challenge for us all to get engaged with. I enjoy it because, you get a sense of purpose, you meet fantastic people, so there's an enjoyment aspect. And part of that enjoyment aspect is the connection. So I think, connecting with people, and particularly me, having worked in, I was working 80, 90 hours a week, and the people I met were all people either, a bit like me, or people who weren't like me, but behaved like me when they were at work. So you only ever saw sort of one dimension of everybody. And now this, opens it up to all sorts of people in all sorts of walks of life. So lots of motivation to do stuff, even if I don't quite know what I'm supposed to be doing. So just back to the point. So we've got this enormous issue. We know we need policy change. We need whole-scale change, system change even. So where does the personal action come in? And I think the sort of my first starting point would be, personal action is critical. So it's critical for every single one of us to get involved in some shape or form. So it can't be a choice. If we want to address this challenge, it cannot be a choice to act, to try and do something or not to do something. We can't have people sitting on the side. When I walked up to Glasgow, I had fantastic conversations with highly educated people who had massive opinions on climate change, but there was a but at the end before they got to actually doing anything. But pointing the finger, but companies, but corporates, but policy, but the government, but China, and it can't be that. Yeah, we know that we all need to get engaged. Now, if we're going to have the sort of mass scale that we need, change we need, so the policy or the private sector sort of really changing fundamentally, of course, politics, particularly in the political framework that we work in, politics work on power. Power is sourced from the people, in our system anyway, to some extent. There's some wrinkles there, but to some extent. And so we are those individuals who need to speak up and make our change. And that is personal action. So using your voice to make political change, whether that's locally or nationally, is obviously personal action, very important, and ultimately aggregated up, that creates the change at the top level, or it should do. The other thing is markets. So of course markets, again, they're just aggregations of individual consumer choices or choices. And so we are part of that aggregation, we're part of those individuals. And if it was just us, again, you might sort of feel despairing, but of course it isn't you, because you make a difference, yeah, and then suddenly the person next to you thinks, oh, that person did, yeah, and it becomes a bit more normalized, and then you hope, obviously, then you're going to drive some form of sort of social contagion, everybody takes off. The other thing to point out is, obviously, the political system and markets tend to be huge, we're small little individuals, but those markets work off change rather than the absolute. And by that I mean, if you've got a stable market, if you think of GDP as an example, right? So what are people obsessed about? They're obsessed about the change in GDP, not the actual absolute level of activity. So you've just got to have a small change in GDP, and the growth level drops, and everybody freaks out, and it's massive news, right? So we don't need everybody to change. You just need people, a small number of people to change the level of growth, or even the level of growth if you've got stable growth levels. And suddenly, whether you're a politician and you're looking at the polls, or you're a market, you're a strategist looking at your company and the company's sales or in the market, those are powerful signals for change. So it doesn't have to be everybody, it needs a small number of people. So my first point was personal action is necessary. The second, of course, is possible. So if it wasn't possible, then it would be exceedingly problematic for us, because we might want to do it, but we can't do it. So luckily in this country, whether we are, and I think of sort of three roles, whether it is as a consumer, we have consumer choice. So we're lucky, and we have consumer choice in our diet or in transport or whatever else. So we do have that choice. The second would be as a citizen. So again, we've talked about the political system. We have ways of exercising our rights and our voice as citizens, all sorts of different ways. So once again, we've got to be choiceful about it, we've got to be selective, we've got to think about where we have agency and what the biggest impact is, but we can choose to act as a concerned citizen and do something about it. And then for those of us who've got careers or career choices, again, you can do that. And these might come at a cost, or certainly a financial cost, they might not. So for instance, I went to a business school and spoke to people who wanted to get into the energy transition. Rich conversation, but the bottom line for them was that those people in that room who were passionate about sort of catalyzing the energy transition were facing a 30-40% discount on the salary that they could command in that part of the sector, rather than, unfortunately, the more traditional and the oil and gas. So, yes, we have choice, yeah. Obviously, those choices can come at a cost, but we do have choice. So first of all, it's critically important that we get involved, and we are, acting, and I'm sure everybody here is. The second, and that we challenge ourselves. The second one, it is possible. So it is possible. It's not in some countries, and it is in this country. I think the third thing is that it brings enormous benefits. And I talked about some of my motivation and the uplifting motivation I've got. But people are here because they're concerned about the climate crisis. One of the things we do in that workshop is we ask people what they feel about the climate crisis. So what emotions does it give rise to? And people cry, people talk about the fact that they won't have children, perhaps, because of their concerns about the climate crisis. People have been exiled from their countries because they've been climate activists. So, it goes from this sort of, the first half of the workshop is all about the IPCC reports and the cause and effect of climate change. And then you get this incredible piece in the middle where people talk about their emotions. So doing something when you face possible, despair, challenge, uncertainty, upset, it feels good, or it ameliorates it to some extent. So I think, one reason to do it, obviously the personal benefit is it feels good. The second, I think personal action brings learning with it. So, and I could think of many examples, and I'm sure you can as well. But for instance, me trying to get solar on my roof has been an awakening. I didn't really know what a kilowatt was. I didn't know how much energy we consumed. I didn't know fully what the grid mix was. I didn't know how any of this worked. And so therefore, I couldn't really advise anybody else. I didn't know who to source it off. I didn't know how much it cost. I didn't know whether or not there was a financial payback. So by going into that as a consumer, at least, I'm not an expert, but at least as an informed consumer now, I can talk to other people about it. So huge learning opportunities, I think, as we take that personal action. I've talked about the connections that I feel I've made in the community. I think that's another reason, because you meet like-minded people as you know, whether or not you're shopping or you're citizens or you're doing your career thing. And there may even be, of course, financial benefits to this as well. So a lot of people obviously are having their household budgets under a lot of strain at the moment, and whether you're reducing your consumption or you're lucky enough to be able to invest in something like solar, then there may indeed possibly be a financial return. Sometimes it's costly, as I said, like the career thing, but sometimes there's a financial return. And the final reason to do it is I think that we have to have, it's not like, you know, the barber having to have the barber doesn't have to be perfectly groomed, right? I mean, obviously you want them clean, but they don't have to be perfect. I'm sorry, I'm talking about something I know nothing about. But, you know, the barber doesn't have to be perfectly groomed, and they can be a very good barber. I think when we are talking about addressing climate change, we have to at least have tried in our own world to do something and to be able to talk about it. Otherwise, we lack integrity. So those are all the reasons I think that personal action are critically important. And then just to sort of round off a few reflections, because it's not easy. And I think the first reason it's not easy is because we're in a compromised system. So it's very difficult for us to step outside of that system, and it's all so interconnected. And an example might be, you know, if you're going to get an electric vehicle, then of course you're thinking, okay, so the electric vehicle, but it's got embodied carbon in it, then I'm taking electricity off the grid's coal powered in part, so you know, you're compromised by the system itself. And I think the reason that's so important is that it affects the tone with which we talk. So you know, we cannot preach about this because nobody is, you know, if you like, fully green, fully clear, fully clean. So as a result of that, I think the hubristic tone that you particularly sometimes get from corporate quarters, I think is particularly inappropriate, unhelpful, and lacking in integrity. But the same can be said of individuals. And I think you get it far less from individuals, but you do tend to get it from corporates. So we're in a compromised system, so therefore we need to be humble, I think, about how we talk about what we're doing and trying to do it. The second thing I would advocate would be for everybody just to have a theory of change. Obviously is a relatively sort of, I don't know, conceptual way of framing it, but we have to explain to ourselves the benefits of our actions and why we believe that those benefits are going to accrue. Because we can do things which are wrong. You know, the argument for the, hopefully it'll never actually happen, but for new coalfield in the UK is that was, as you probably read, that was, you know, coking coal, and therefore that's going to be efficient, and that's there to create steel, and it's not there for the energy, and you know, that's cheaper than importing, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, somebody has spent quite a lot of time trying to construct that narrative about why that's actually a positive thing for climate change as opposed to a negative thing, right? Now, I suspect, and I hope many of us, if not everybody in the room, wouldn't agree with that. But it's important when we do our direct actions to think about the sort of the cause and effect and the assumptions we're making when we think we're making a good thing. So, you know, is it better to have something which is vegan and imported from, you know, Australia, or to eat meat which is being grown next door? And I think, you know, if we're going to leverage our direct action by talking about it to others, we have to be prepared to explain to people. And we don't know if we're fully right or not, but by having that story and that little theory of change, I'm doing this because of that, and you know, these are the one or two, you know, things I've read that support that. We can enrich that as we go, and we can learn, and we can develop that, and we can become more compelling when we tell other people. So, so I think that in terms of personal action, it's critical, absolutely critical. We can do it. There are obvious benefits to it. It is sort of challenging, yeah, and because of the system we live in. But we've got to move forward on it. And so, you know, I hope that we should all have that mantra of doing. As we do, we learn. After we've done and learned, we tell, and then we do it again, and we do it again, and we do it again, consistently. And never underestimate the power that, you know, each of us has we don't know the impact that we'll have on others. We don't know how much influence. We don't know that casual conversation with somebody you don't even know, what the impact that might have. And I think that sort of, so I am, I guess, an optimist at heart, but I do believe in that sort of unintended consequence, the butterfly wings in one part of the world have an impact somewhere else, or the ripple in the water, whatever you want to call it. But that opportunity for positive unintended consequences, I think should always be at the forefront of your mind. And what I do know is from the walks and the things I've done, the things that are most memorable are things which weren't necessarily that obvious. So for instance, a mid-80s person saying that our little sort of appy thing that we had encouraged him to walk, and he hadn't walked for a significant period of time. Now, that wasn't necessarily climate change, but it wasn't a positive impact I'd expected. But somebody else had a breakdown, mid-30s, and it had got her back into the game because she'd organised a team and felt sort of, agency and acted. So again, it wasn't directly climate related. It was an unintended but positive impact. And those, I happened upon those anecdotes. I didn't go out and seek them, and I happened upon them. So just to finish off, I just want to say that the most impactful thing out of all of this for me was going to a school on the way up. It was in Scotland, and we spoke to the school, and we were the first people pretty much after COVID to go and actually physically talk to the school. So we're lucky, we just sort of hit them. And we were knackered. I mean, we were walking all day, and it was cold and wet and whatever. We sit in front of these children, and first of all, there were most amazing questions, really challenging questions. So somebody's like, right, I've got a climate campaign and I've got 5 posters ready. And this is a little girl of about 12, I've got a climate campaign and I've got my posters ready. I'm really concerned about, the ink and the paper and what the carbon footprint's going to be. And, that sort of, sort of caught in the headlights, didn't know what to say. That was amazing. But then just at the end, the teacher said, and I'm sort of joking, just remembering it. So the teacher said, does anybody want to stay and ask questions? And so it was all girls, actually. All the girls stayed. All the boys started sort of pinching each other and running off, but all the girls stayed, or some of them. And one little girl put up her hand and just said, it's not really a question. I just want to thank you for coming to talk to us and for bringing this important point, important agenda to our, whatever she said, important agenda to our notice. And it just, all 3 of us on this, were just like, oh my God, that was just, and it was so inspiring for us. So, if I hadn't done anything else, it would have been worth it for that single, interaction with that little girl. So anyway, thank you. Adam, over to you. Continue.